In Normandy's hedgerows, thousands of soldiers were dying. The solution came from a welding machine. June 1944. Normandy, France. The beaches were taken. The world thought liberation was hours away. Soldiers had stormed Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. They had crossed the killing fields. They had breached the Atlantic Wall. The hardest part, everyone believed, was over. But no one had warned them about the hedgerows. These weren't ordinary bushes. They were ancient earth walls, 10 feet high, thick as concrete, wrapped in roots older than America itself. For 1,000 years, French farmers had piled dirt and stone to mark their property lines. Generation after generation, the walls grew denser, taller, stronger. By 1944, they were geological fortifications. The Germans knew it. They turned every field into a fortress. Every hedge hid a Panzer, a machine gun nest, an 88mm cannon waiting in silence. The bocage, Normandy's farmland, had become the deadliest terrain in the European theater. Sherman tanks would push through a gap, and the moment their belly lifted, exposed, vulnerable, unarmored, German gunners would fire. One shot. The Sherman would explode from the inside. Ammunition would cook off. The crew never had time to scream. They just burned. In the first week after D-Day, the Allies lost more tanks to hedgerows than to enemy armor. Entire battalions stalled. Generals screamed into radios. Engineers drew diagrams that went nowhere. West Point tacticians proposed solutions that required equipment that didn't exist. The invasion, the largest amphibious assault in human history, was grinding to a halt because of dirt and roots. And then, in a field workshop lit by a single oil lamp, a man who wasn't supposed to be a hero picked up a welding torch. But no one in command believed him. And that's exactly why it worked. His name was Curtis G. Cullen Jr. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an officer. He was a sergeant from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a unit that wasn't even supposed to be fighting in hedgerow country. Before the war, he'd fixed tractors on a farm in New Jersey. His father had been a mechanic. His grandfather had been a blacksmith. His hands knew metal. His mind knew problems. And in Normandy, he saw the biggest problem of his life. Every time a Sherman tried to push through a hedgerow, the same thing happened. The tank would hit the wall. The nose would tilt upward as the tracks tried to climb. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, the armored belly, the weakest point on the entire vehicle, would be exposed to enemy fire. That was all the Germans needed. Cullen watched it happen 6 times in 2 days. 6 crews. 18 men. All of them burning alive inside steel coffins. He couldn't sleep. The sound stayed with him. Not the explosions. Not the gunfire. The screaming. Metal conducted sound. You could hear men dying from 100 yards away. So one night, he walked alone to the edge of a blasted beach where the Germans had left behind their obstacles, massive steel hedgehogs designed to rip apart landing craft. Twisted beams welded at angles. Brutal. Functional. Effective. He stared at the rusted metal. Then he looked back toward the fields, where another burnout Sherman sat, smoke still rising from the open hatches. And in that moment, something clicked. Not a weapon. A plow. If you could mount heavy steel prongs on the front of a Sherman, low and angled forward like the teeth of a harrow, the tank wouldn't climb the hedgerow. It would bite into it. Cut through it. Like a farmer's plow ripping through frozen dirt in March. The more he thought about it, the more obvious it seemed. The tank wasn't the problem. The approach was. Everyone was trying to go over the hedgerows. Why not go through? The next morning, he told his lieutenant. The lieutenant laughed. Not cruelly. Just tired. Sergeant, we've got engineers from MIT working on this. We've got ordnance specialists from Detroit. You think a farm boy with a welding torch is going to solve what they can't? Cullen didn't argue. There was no point. Officers didn't listen to sergeants, and engineers didn't listen to mechanics. That's just how it was. So he waited until night. He dragged a section of German beach obstacle back to the motor pool. It took 3 men to move it. Found a welding rig in the back of a supply truck. Borrowed a cutting torch from an engineer unit that wasn't using it. No permission. No paperwork. No requests up the chain of command. Just a hunch and a deadline. By 400 hours, he'd welded 2 steel prongs onto the front of a Sherman. Crude. Ugly. Bolted at an angle that felt right in his gut but made no sense on any blueprint. The welds were rough. The metal was scarred and pitted from seawater. It looked like something a scrapyard would reject. He didn't tell anyone. He just waited for morning. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because the most unbelievable part of this one is still ahead. When the sun came up, Cullen's commanding officer, a captain from Pennsylvania, saw the modified tank and went pale. "What the hell is that?" "A hedgerow cutter, sir." "Did anyone authorize this?" "No, sir." The captain's jaw tightened. "Then you're gonna rip it off right now, or I'm gonna have you court-martialed for destruction of army property." Cullen looked at him. His face was blank. Tired. He'd been awake for 30 hours. "Sir, with respect, let me test it first. If it doesn't work, I'll rip it off myself. If it does work, you can take credit for it." The captain stared at him. Then at the steel prongs jutting from the Sherman's nose like horns. Then at the hedgerow 200 yards away, where another burnout Sherman sat, crew still inside, waiting for Graves' registration. He looked back at Cullen. "You've got 10 minutes. If you get that tank stuck, you're paying for the recovery." Cullen climbed into the driver's seat. The interior smelled like oil and sweat and fear. Every surface was scorched from men who died in tanks just like this one. He adjusted the seat. Checked the controls. The engine growled to life, a deep mechanical roar that shook the ground. He aimed the Sherman straight at the hedgerow. No one spoke. A dozen soldiers had gathered to watch. Some thought it was suicide. Others thought it was a waste of time. A few were placing bets. The Sherman lurched forward. 10 miles per hour. 15. 20. Cullen could see the hedgerow growing larger in the viewport. Thick. Ancient. Immovable. 30 yards. 20. 10. And then the tank hit. The steel prongs bit into the earth wall like teeth into meat. The hedgerow didn't stop the tank. It didn't lift the nose. The Sherman's tread stayed flat, gripping the ground, all 60,000 pounds of armor driving forward. The engine screamed. The hull shook. Dirt exploded upward. Roots snapped like rifle shots. 3 seconds later, the tank burst through the other side. Intact. Level. Unscathed. The soldiers stood in stunned silence. Then one of them, a kid from Ohio who'd never seen a tank do anything but burn, started clapping. Slow. Deliberate. Then another joined. And another. Within seconds, the entire motor pool was cheering. The captain just stared. His mouth hung open. Cullen climbed out of the tank, face covered in dirt, and looked at him. "Permission to install these on every Sherman in the battalion, sir?" The captain nodded. He couldn't find words. Commanders laughed at him, until they saw what happened next. Within hours, word spread up the chain of command like wildfire. A captain saw it and told a major. The major told the colonel. The colonel told the general. By noon, General Omar Bradley, commander of the entire U.S. First Army, drove out personally to see the hillbilly contraption. Bradley was a quiet man. Methodical. He didn't believe in miracles. But he believed in results. He watched Cullen run the test again. This time through a thicker hedgerow, one that had stopped 3 previous Shermans. Same result. Clean cut. No exposure. No vulnerability. The tank went through like a knife through cloth. Bradley didn't say much. He just turned to his aide, a logistics officer from West Virginia. "I want 500 of these. By the end of the week." The aide blinked. "Sir, we don't have the industrial capacity." "Then make it. Weld them in the field." Use scrap. Use German steel. Rip apart every beach obstacle from here to Cherbourg. I don't care how you do it. Every Sherman in Normandy gets one of these by August 1st. The aide swallowed. Yes, sir. And that's exactly what happened. In a logistics miracle that would never be repeated, American forces mobilized every welding team, every mechanic, every engineer in the European theater. They scavenged steel from destroyed German bunkers, from beach obstacles, from wrecked vehicles, from blown bridges. Blacksmiths who hadn't touched a forge in 20 years were drafted to help. Mechanics who'd been repairing engines were reassigned to cutting and welding. Within 72 hours, over 300 Shermans had been fitted with Kulin's hedgerow cutters. By the end of July, it was over 2,000. By August, nearly every tank in Normandy had one. The device had no official name. The army wanted to call it the M1 hedgerow cutting device. Soldiers ignored that. They called it the Rhino, because of the prongs. Some called it the Kulin cutter. Others just called it that farm thing the sergeant built. But every single one of them knew what it meant. It meant they might survive. But this is the moment no one in the entire war ever saw coming. Operation Cobra. July 25, 1944. The Allies were preparing for a massive breakout from Normandy. The plan was ambitious. Concentrate overwhelming force at a single point, punch through German lines, and race across France before the enemy could regroup. Thousands of tanks. Tens of thousands of men. Artillery barrages that would last for hours. Carpet bombing runs that would flatten entire grid squares. It was supposed to be the decisive blow. But the Germans knew it was coming. Intelligence reports. Aerial reconnaissance. Intercepted radio chatter. They reinforced every hedgerow in the sector. Dug in Panzer IVs and Tiger tanks at every crossroad. Laid mines in every field. Built interlocking fields of fire that would turn the bocage into a meat grinder. German commanders were confident. The hedgerows had held for 6 weeks. They would hold for 6 more. It should have been a bloodbath. Instead, it was a slaughter, for the Germans. Because now, the Shermans didn't stop at hedgerows. They didn't wait for engineers to blow gaps with explosives. They didn't crawl forward, exposed and vulnerable, hoping to find a break in the wall. They charged. Rhino tanks hit the bocage at full speed, ripping through hedgerows before German gunners could adjust fire. They flanked Panzer positions that had been considered invincible. They moved through terrain that German commanders had marked on their maps as impassable. A Panzer IV, dug into a hedgerow with perfect concealment and a clear field of fire, would wait for the Sherman to expose itself climbing over the wall. But the Sherman never climbed. It cut straight through, appearing 10 feet to the left of where the German gunner expected. By the time the Panzer rotated its turret, the Sherman had already fired. It happened again. And again. And again. In 3 days, the German front collapsed. Not slowly. Not in an organized retreat. It shattered. Entire divisions fell back in chaos. Supply lines broke. Communication networks went dark. Panzer units, designed to dominate open ground, found themselves surrounded in their own defensive positions, cut off by tanks that moved through terrain they thought was impassable. By August 1st, the Allies had broken out of Normandy entirely. By August 25th, they had liberated Paris. By September, they were on the German border. Historians would later call it the turning point of the Western Front. The moment the war in Europe became a race to Berlin instead of a grinding stalemate. But the men in the tanks knew the truth. It wasn't air superiority. It wasn't overwhelming numbers. It wasn't brilliant strategy from some general's headquarters. It was a farm boy with a welding torch who refused to accept. Impossible. Curtis G. Kulin Jr. was awarded the Legion of Merit for his invention. General Bradley personally pinned the medal to his chest in a field ceremony. Photographers took pictures. War correspondents wrote stories. But Kulin didn't care about any of it. He never gave interviews. Never wrote a memoir. After the war, he went back to New Jersey. fixed tractors, married a schoolteacher, had 3 kids, lived in the same house for 40 years. When someone once asked him how he came up with the idea, he shrugged. I just looked at the problem different. Everybody was trying to go over the hedges. I figured, why not go through? It wasn't genius. It was just common sense. That's it. No grand philosophy. No complex engineering theory. Just a man who saw a problem and refused to overthink it. But here's the thing, the idea wasn't what mattered. Plenty of people had ideas. Engineers had drawn up plans for hedge-clearing devices. Some of them were brilliant. Some would have worked beautifully, if they'd had 6 months and a factory to build them. Cullen didn't have 6 months. He had 1 night and a welding torch. What made him different wasn't intelligence. It was urgency. He didn't solve the problem because he was smarter than everyone else. He solved it because he couldn't stand to hear one more crew burning alive. That's the part people forget. Heroes aren't born from inspiration. They're born from desperation. The Rhino attachment became standard U.S. Army field modification procedure. Variations of it were used in Korea, where tanks faced similar terrain problems in rice paddies and hill country. In Vietnam, engineers adapted the concept for jungle clearing operations. Modern combat engineering still teaches Cullen's field modification as a case study in adaptive problem-solving under fire. But here's what stays with you, long after the history lesson ends. Cullen didn't invent the hedgerow cutter because he was brilliant. He invented it because he had to. Because every night, he heard men screaming inside burning steel. Because waiting for someone smarter, someone higher ranked, someone with more authority to solve the problem, that would have meant more deaths. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for a committee to approve his design. He didn't fill out requisition forms or submit proposals through proper channels. He just built the damn thing. And in doing so, he changed the course of the war. There's a piece of rusted steel in the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum in Aberdeen, Maryland. It's displayed in a glass case, labeled simply, Hedgerow Cutting Device, Normandy 1944. Invented by Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, Jr. It's stained with oil. Scarred with rough weld marks. Bent in places where it smashed through roots and stone. One of the prongs is shorter than the other, because Cullen ran out of steel and had to improvise. It doesn't look like much. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. But if you know the story, if you understand what that ugly piece of metal represents, you see it for what it really is. A reminder that history isn't always written by generals in marble halls. Sometimes, it's written by mechanics in muddy fields. By sergeants who disobey orders. By farm boys who refuse to accept that something can't be done just because no one's done it before. The greatest ideas don't always come from the smartest people. They come from the people who care enough to try. But there's another layer to this story that almost no one talks about. A darker truth hidden beneath the triumph. When Cullen first presented his idea to command, he wasn't just fighting bureaucracy. He was fighting doctrine. The U.S. Army in 1944 had a manual for everything. Tank operation. Field repairs. Combat tactics. Equipment modification required approval from ordnance officers, engineering corps, and sometimes even Pentagon review boards. Cullen broke every single rule. He took enemy salvage without authorization. He modified Army property without permission. He conducted an unauthorized field test with a 60,000-pound vehicle that could have killed a dozen men if something went wrong. By the book, he should have been court-martialed. But here's what saved him: results. In war, results erase sins. A bad idea executed perfectly gets you promoted. A good idea executed poorly gets you buried. Cullen's idea worked, so the paperwork disappeared. Orders were retroactively issued. Reports were filed after the fact. The system didn't reward him for breaking the rules. It rewarded him for being right. That's the uncomfortable truth about innovation in crisis. Sometimes, the only way to save lives is to disobey the people who think they know better. Sometimes, progress requires insubordination. And Cullen understood that instinctively. He didn't ask for forgiveness later because he thought he'd be forgiven. He asked for forgiveness because men were dying now, and permission would come too late. There's a letter in the National Archives, written by one of the tank crews that used a Rhino cutter during Operation Cobra. It was found in a footlocker 50 years after the war. The soldier never mailed it. He just kept it. It reads, "Dear Sarge, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know your name. But I'm the gunner in the 4th tank that went through the hedgerow at St. Lo. The one that didn't explode. We all thought we were dead. Every man in this platoon thought the same thing, we're going to burn just like the others. But we didn't. We went through that wall like it wasn't even there. I don't know how to say this without sounding stupid, but you saved my life. You saved all of us. I hope someone tells you that. I hope someone says thank you." The letter was signed, but the name is illegible. Water damage. Time. Doesn't matter. Because that letter could have been written by any of the 20,000 men who rode in Rhino tanks between July and December 1944. 20,000 soldiers who went home instead of burning in French fields. Cullen never knew about the letter. He never knew most of their names. But they knew his. In the decades after the war, veterans would sometimes track him down. Show up at his repair shop in New Jersey. Shake his hand. Some of them cried. Most just said, "Thank you," and left. Cullen never knew what to say. He'd just nod, wipe his hands on a rag, and go back to work. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a mechanic who'd done his job. But that's the thing about real heroes. They never think they're heroes. They just think they're people who did what needed to be done. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. The world doesn't need more geniuses. It has plenty of smart people with good ideas who never act on them because they're waiting for permission, waiting for funding, waiting for the right moment. What the world needs is more people like Curtis Cullen. People who see a problem, grab a torch, and build the solution, even if no one believes it'll work. Even if it's ugly. Even if it breaks the rules. Because in the end, history doesn't remember the people who followed procedure. It remembers the people who saved lives. Share this story, because forgotten heroes deserve to live forever.